The Call of the Wild. In the secluded coastal town of Seabrook, nestled between the rhythmic waves of the ocean and the mystery of the sprawling forest, there lived a man named Milo. Known for his deep connection to nature, Milo was a fisherman by trade. Yet his soul resonated more with the calls of the forest than the open sea. He had a small, weather-worn cottage by the shore, filled with simple comforts, the scent of driftwood, and the soft rustle of handmade nets drying in the corner. His life, while modest, was filled with a profound sense of peace that only solitude could bring. As the seasons change, Milo often found himself drawn to the forest. Over the years, he had become a silent guardian to the wildlife that roamed the dense woods, especially the wolves. Their howls had accompanied him on many moonlit nights, weaving into the very fabric of his life. Among these wolves was Luna, an awe-inspiring creature with silver fur and blue eyes that mirrored the ocean on a clear winter day. She was the matriarch of her pack, and she had accepted Milo's presence, almost as if he was part of her extended family. Milo had a special bond with Luna's cubs, particularly a timid, jet-black pup named Shadow. The little cub was shy and tended to hide behind his siblings, his eyes darting with curiosity whenever Milo visited. Over time, Shadow had grown to trust Milo, allowing the fisherman to feed him, even resting his head on Milo's lap during quiet moments in the clearing. The cubs had brought joy into Milo's solitary life, filling it with laughter as he watched them play and explore the world around them. On a crisp autumn morning, Milo set out to prepare his boat, hoping to catch the day's first light on the water. But as he gathered his gear, a strange sensation pulled at him. He turned to find the wolf cubs clustered near his cottage, their tiny bodies huddled in a protective circle, their eyes fixed on him with an intensity he hadn't seen before. They seemed nervous, their usual playfulness replaced by an unsettling stillness. Milo put down his fishing gear and approached them, his heart pounding with a strange mix of curiosity and dread. He counted the cubs, his gaze darting from one to another. Shadow was missing. His absence left a noticeable void, and Milo's heart sank as he considered the possibilities. Shadow was the smallest of the litter and often strayed behind, exploring with an innocent curiosity that could easily lead him into trouble. He gathered his belongings, packing water, a small first aid kit, and a blanket before setting off into the woods. The cubs moved swiftly, guiding him with a sense of urgency, weaving through the trees like silent shadows. Despite the chill in the air, Milo felt warmth in the bond he shared with these wolves, their wordless connection leading him deeper into the forest's secrets. The forest was alive with the sounds of autumn. Leaves crunched beneath his boots, and the air smelled of damp earth and pine. The cubs darted ahead, pausing only to make sure he was still following, their eyes glowing in the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy above. Milo could sense their worry, a feeling that weighed heavily on him as they moved farther from the familiar paths and into a part of the forest that even he rarely ventured. As they continued, Milo began to notice signs of a disturbance. Branches were broken, and patches of earth looked freshly upturned, as though something had recently struggled here. His pulse quickened, but he forced himself to stay calm, his focus on the cubs who seemed to know precisely where they were going. After what felt like hours, they finally stopped, their bodies tense as they stared intently ahead. Milo followed their gaze and saw Shadow, suspended in a hunter's snare, his small body dangling, his fur matted, and his eyes filled with fear. The sight struck Milo with a sense of dread he hadn't known before. Shadow's whimpers barely reached him, weak and strained, as if the cub was exhausted from struggling against the trap. Milo approached cautiously, his hands trembling as he took in the severity of the situation. The snare was old but deadly, made with cruel precision, and Shadow's leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, the skin cut deeply. Milo's heart ached as he watched the cub, helpless and vulnerable, his eyes reflecting the trust he had in his human friend even amidst the pain. Just as he was about to move closer, Milo froze. A low growl rumbled through the underbrush, and out of the shadows emerged a large, aggressive dog, its eyes fixed on Shadow. The dog's posture was defensive, its hackles raised and teeth bared in a menacing display. Milo realized that this dog had claimed the area as its territory and wasn't about to let an outsider interfere. The situation was dire. Milo couldn't just walk away, but he also knew that a sudden move could provoke the dog into attacking either him or Shadow. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a piece of dried meat he brought along, hoping it would distract the dog long enough to save Shadow. With a silent prayer, he tossed the meat toward the dog. It hesitated, sniffing the air, eyes flicking between Milo and the food. Milo took this fleeting opportunity to move closer to Shadow, his hands working quickly to examine the snare. He whispered softly to the cub, hoping his voice would provide some comfort amidst the pain. "Hold on, little one. We're getting you out of here." Shadow's eyes, though filled with pain, reflected a glimmer of hope. Milo's heart swelled with determination as he carefully loosened the snare, speaking gentle words of reassurance. Shadow seemed to relax under his touch, his trust in Milo unwavering even as his body trembled from the ordeal. As he freed the cub, the dog let out another growl, but it stayed by the meat Milo had tossed, giving him just enough time to lift Shadow into his arms. Cradling the cub gently, Milo felt a mix of relief and urgency. Shadow's injuries were severe, and he was losing blood fast. There was no time to waste. He wrapped the cub in the warm blanket he brought, assessing the damage as quickly as he could. The snare had cut deeply, leaving wounds that were now stained with dried leaves and dirt. Milo knew he needed to act fast to prevent infection and stop the bleeding before it was too late. Using strips of cloth torn from his own shirt, Milo fashioned a makeshift bandage around the injured leg, working with care despite the urgency of the moment. He cleaned the wounds with water and applied pressure, hoping to stem the flow of blood. Shadow's breathing was shallow, his body growing weaker by the minute. As Milo worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that this trap wasn't placed by an ordinary hunter. The craftsmanship was peculiar, the kind that hinted at someone with knowledge of snares far beyond the typical poacher. The thought unsettled him, but he pushed it aside for the moment, focusing instead on stabilizing Shadow's injuries. The cubs, sensing that Milo had freed their brother, gathered close, pressing their small bodies against his legs as if offering support. They watched him with wide, trusting eyes, their silent presence lending him the strength he needed to carry on. With Shadow secure in his arms, Milo prepared to make the journey back to his cottage. But as he turned to leave, he couldn't shake the feeling that something dark was lurking in the depths of the forest, something that wouldn't rest until its traps claimed their prey. Shadows deepened. Milo's journey back through the dense woods was anything but simple. As he carried Shadow wrapped tightly in his blanket, he was acutely aware of the fragile life in his arms. The other cubs padded along beside him, their normally boundless energy subdued. They moved in a protective formation, casting wary glances into the shadows as if sensing an unseen danger lurking just beyond their sight. It was as though they knew that their family's unity had been disturbed, that something dark was weaving its way into their once peaceful existence. The forest seemed different now, its silence a heavy, watchful presence that pressed down on them with every step. Milo knew these woods well, but tonight, the familiar trees and pathways seemed twisted, foreign, like a labyrinth designed to disorient. The gentle crunch of autumn leaves underfoot felt ominous, a muted echo in the otherwise silent forest. Milo kept his pace steady, glancing around, his senses alert for any sign of movement. He couldn't shake the feeling that he and the cubs were being watched. As they moved, Milo couldn't help but replay the sight of Shadow trapped in that hunter's snare, the helpless cub struggling, his small body bruised and battered. The snare itself had been intricate, almost methodically crafted, as though designed with intelligence and purpose. It wasn't the careless handiwork of an amateur hunter. It had the look of something more sinister, something placed with an intention that Milo didn't yet understand. The thought troubled him deeply. About halfway through their trek back to the cottage, Milo felt a tug on his shirt. He looked down to see one of the cubs, a gray one with a scar over its left ear, staring at him with large, imploring eyes. It whined softly and nudged him toward a narrow, overgrown path that diverged from the main trail. Milo hesitated. This was not the usual route he took home, and the path was barely visible, nearly swallowed up by thick brambles and fallen leaves. Yet the cub seemed insistent, as if trying to communicate something beyond Milo's understanding. He felt an inexplicable urge to trust the cub's instincts. Adjusting his grip on Shadow, he nodded to the cubs, allowing them to lead the way down the narrow trail. The cubs moved with purpose, and as they did, Milo's own unease began to deepen. He was venturing into an unknown part of the forest, a place where even his own footsteps felt foreign and misplaced. The deeper they went, the stranger the forest became. The trees grew denser, their branches twisting together in unnatural shapes, creating a canopy that blocked out even the faintest slivers of moonlight. The air was thick and still, carrying a scent of decay and damp earth that clung to Milo's senses, making each breath feel like inhaling shadows. He gripped Shadow more tightly, feeling the cub's soft, shallow breaths against his chest. Shadow's fur was warm but matted with dried blood, a reminder of the urgency that kept him pressing forward despite the fear gnawing at the edge of his mind. As they ventured further, they came upon a small clearing, where the faint remnants of a campfire lay scattered across the forest floor. The sight gave Milo pause. The campfire looked recent, its embers dark, but the wood still stacked in a careful arrangement. Whoever had been here had left in a hurry, as if something had forced them to abandon their post. Scattered around the fire were various items, a few scraps of cloth, an empty tin cup, and a hunting knife lying half-buried in the dirt. Milo knelt beside the knife, his fingers tracing its blade. It was sharp, its handle worn from use. There was something unsettling about the scene, a feeling that whoever had been here had left something behind, something hidden just beneath the surface of this abandoned camp. He searched the ground carefully, noticing footprints in the soft earth that led away from the fire and into the dense underbrush. They were deep, as if made by someone or something heavy, and the sight sent a chill down his spine. One of the cubs, Luna's eldest, a large silver wolf named Storm, sniffed the ground and let out a low growl, his ears flattened against his head. The other cubs tensed, their bodies alert, their eyes fixed on the path the footprints had taken. Milo felt a rush of adrenaline, a primal warning that danger was close, perhaps even closer than he realized. Deciding it was time to leave, Milo scooped up Shadow and turned to retrace his steps. But as he began to walk, a faint rustling sound came from behind him, followed by a soft, almost imperceptible whisper that made his blood run cold. It was as though the forest itself was speaking, its voice a low, haunting murmur that filled the air around him. He paused, straining to listen, but the whisper was gone, replaced once again by an oppressive silence. Milo quickened his pace, his heart racing as he navigated through the dense undergrowth. The cubs moved closer to him, their usual confidence replaced by a cautious, almost fearful energy. He pushed through branches and brambles, his mind racing with thoughts of who or what might be lurking in these woods. The shadows seemed to shift around him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Milo and the cubs emerged from the dense forest, the familiar path to his cottage visible through the trees. The relief was short-lived, however, as he noticed something disturbing on the ground near the entrance to his property, a small totem made of twisted twigs and bones, tied together with strands of animal sinew. It was primitive but intricately designed, a strange symbol that Milo had never seen before. He bent down, examining the totem closely. Its placement felt deliberate, as though someone had left it as a message or a warning. The bones were bleached white, and the twigs formed a pattern that resembled a spiral, its shape unnatural and almost hypnotic. Milo felt a shiver run down his spine as he realized that this was no random artifact. Someone had placed it here, someone who knew he would find it. Unease settled over him like a dark cloud as he carried Shadow into his cottage, shutting the door firmly behind him. He gently laid the injured cub on a makeshift bed, his hands working quickly to tend to the wounds. Shadow was weak, his breathing shallow, but he responded to Milo's touch with a soft whimper, his eyes fluttering open for a brief moment. The other cubs settled around Shadow, their small bodies curling protectively around their injured sibling. Milo watched them, his heart heavy with worry. He had saved Shadow, but the feeling of dread hadn't lifted. If anything, it had only deepened. The totem outside, the abandoned campfire, and the ominous footprints all hinted at something lurking in the forest, something that threatened not only the wolves but perhaps the entire town of Seabrook. Milo sat by the fire, his gaze drifting to the small, dark window that overlooked the forest. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches swaying in the night breeze. He knew he couldn't ignore what he had seen. The totem was a warning, a sign that the forest held dangers he couldn't yet understand. Someone, or something, had set the snare that nearly claimed Shadow's life, and Milo was certain it was no ordinary hunter. As he sat there, a thought began to take shape in his mind. He would have to venture back into the forest, to follow the trail of footprints he had found near the campfire. If he wanted to keep the cubs, and himself, safe, he needed to understand what he was dealing with. The forest had always been his sanctuary, but now, it was a place of shadows and secrets, hiding something far darker than he had ever imagined. With a final glance at the sleeping cubs, Milo gathered a few supplies, steeling himself for the journey that lay ahead. The answers he sought were buried in the heart of the forest, hidden within its ancient trees and tangled roots. And if he was going to protect those he cared for, he would need to confront whatever lurked in the darkness, whatever had claimed these woods as its own. Into the depths of darkness. The following morning, as the first pale light of dawn seeped through the mist and into Milo's small cottage, he awoke with a sense of purpose. His mind lingered on the totem by his door, the abandoned campfire, and the footprints that led deep into the forest. Shadow lay beside him, resting under the care of his pack, his breathing steady but shallow. Milo had done what he could for the cub's injuries, but he knew that rest alone might not be enough. There was something sinister afoot, something that had its claws in the heart of his forest, and he was determined to uncover it. The cubs watched as Milo prepared his backpack, gathering more supplies this time. Dried meat, water, medical items, and an old, sturdy knife that had belonged to his father. As he slung the pack over his shoulder, he caught a glimpse of the cubs, their eyes following him with silent understanding. They, too, sensed the urgency of his mission and seemed ready to accompany him, but he knew the journey he was about to undertake was far too dangerous. He knelt beside the cubs, speaking softly. "You must stay here and look after Shadow. I'll be back soon, I promise." The cubs whimpered softly, nudging him with their noses as if urging him to be careful. Milo's heart ached, but he steeled himself, giving them a reassuring nod before stepping out into the cold, mist-laden morning. The forest was shrouded in an eerie silence, the usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves conspicuously absent. The mist clung low to the ground, winding through the trees like ghostly fingers, obscuring the path ahead. Milo set off toward the direction of the clearing where he'd found the abandoned campfire. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though the forest itself was trying to hold him back, warning him of the darkness that lay ahead. As he ventured deeper, he began to notice small, unnatural details that unsettled him. Strange markings scared the bark of certain trees, symbols etched into the wood with precision and purpose. They were symbols he didn't recognize, spirals, triangles, and shapes that seemed to twist and writhe as he looked at them. Each marking felt charged with a strange energy, a sense of malice that made his skin prickle. These symbols were recent, their edges sharp and clear, as if someone had carved them with intent and purpose. The path twisted and turned, leading him further away from familiar ground. Shadows seemed to thicken around him, obscuring the way back and making the forest feel more like a maze with each passing step. Milo was no stranger to the wilderness, yet this part of the forest felt different, more menacing, as if something ancient and vengeful was stirring beneath the surface. As he pushed through the thick underbrush, Milo finally reached the clearing. The remnants of the campfire were still there, along with the footprints he had seen the night before. They were deep, heavier than a person's natural gait, almost as if whoever had left them had been dragging something or someone. He studied the ground closely, noting the direction of the prints. They led north, toward a part of the forest he had never ventured, a place known in local legends as the Veiled Grove. The Veiled Grove was a secluded and sinister section of the forest, shrouded in mystery and dread. The villagers spoke of it in hushed tones, recounting tales of travelers who had disappeared without a trace, of strange sounds that echoed through the night, and of lights that flickered among the trees only to vanish when approached. Milo had always dismissed these tales as folklore, but now, as he stood there, he felt a tremor of unease that made him question everything he thought he knew. He followed the trail cautiously, the silence around him growing heavier, almost suffocating. His footsteps seemed amplified in the stillness, each crackle of a twig or rustle of a leaf sounding like a thunderclap in the quiet forest. The path grew narrower, hemmed in by thick brambles that snagged at his clothes and left scratches on his exposed skin. It was as if the forest was closing in on him, trying to turn him back. After what felt like hours of navigating the dense and foreboding landscape, Milo noticed the trees beginning to thin out. The ground sloped downward into a hollow where thick fog pooled like smoke, giving the area an ethereal and unnerving appearance. At the center of this hollow was an ancient stone altar, weathered and covered in moss, its surface etched with symbols similar to those he had seen on the trees. The sight of the altar sent a chill through Milo's veins. He approached cautiously, his eyes scanning the surroundings. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, and something else, something metallic and faintly rancid. The altar was surrounded by strange artifacts, small animal bones arranged in patterns, bundles of dried herbs tied with string, and what looked like human hair twisted into knots. Milo's mind raced. This wasn't the work of any hunter or trapper he knew. This was something ritualistic, something dark. He could feel a palpable sense of dread emanating from the altar, a sense that this place had been used for something terrible. As he circled the stone, examining the markings, he noticed a shallow indentation in the ground nearby. It looked like a grave, hastily dug and recently filled. Before he could investigate further, a low growl echoed through the hollow, freezing him in place. Milo's hand instinctively went to his knife, gripping it tightly as he scanned the trees. Out of the mist emerged a figure, cloaked and hooded, moving with an unsettling silence. The figure was tall and broad-shouldered, its face obscured by a dark hood. It stood at the edge of the hollow, watching Milo with an intensity that made his blood run cold. "Who are you?" Milo called out, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his insides. The figure said nothing, remaining motionless, its presence exuding a quiet menace. Slowly, it raised a hand, pointing toward the altar as if commanding Milo to approach. Milo's instincts screamed at him to run, but something about the figure's gaze held him in place, an unspoken threat that if he dared to turn his back, he wouldn't make it out of the forest alive. Summoning his courage, Milo took a step closer to the altar, his eyes never leaving the figure. The silence was broken only by the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze, a sound that felt almost mocking in the face of his mounting dread. The figure watched him, its head tilted slightly, as though assessing him. As Milo reached the altar, he noticed a small object placed in the center, a wolf's tooth, worn and polished, tied to a strip of leather. It was unmistakably Luna's tooth, one she had lost in a fight with another wolf months ago, a tooth Milo himself had found and kept as a keepsake in his cottage. His heart raced as he realized what this meant. Whoever this figure was, they had been inside his home. They had been close enough to his life to know of his bond with the wolves. Rage and fear warred within him as he faced the figure. "What do you want?" he demanded, his voice stronger now, laced with defiance. The figure remained silent, but slowly lowered its hood, revealing a face covered in strange markings, symbols etched into the skin. The eyes were cold and devoid of humanity, a gaze that pierced through Milo with a chilling emptiness. With a low, raspy voice, the figure finally spoke, each word dripping with a quiet malice. "The forest has been claimed, its guardians have been summoned, and trespassers will pay the price." Milo tightened his grip on the knife, feeling a surge of anger. "The wolves are the guardians of this forest. They protect it, not harm it. Whatever you're doing here, it's wrong." The figure's lips twisted into a cruel smile. "The wolves are only a part of the old ways. There are forces older, hungrier, and they demand sacrifice. You should have left the cub to its fate." With those words, the figure stepped back into the mist, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. Milo stood there, his heart pounding, his mind reeling from the encounter. He turned his gaze back to the altar, the wolf's tooth still resting there as a grim reminder of the threat he now faced. Realizing he needed to return to the cottage before nightfall, Milo turned away from the hollow, retracing his steps through the forest. But as he walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed, that unseen eyes were watching his every move. The forest seemed alive with a dark, predatory energy, and he could feel it pressing in on him, whispering threats in a language only the wild understood. When he finally reached the edge of the forest and saw his cottage in the distance, he breathed a sigh of relief. But the dread lingered. He knew now that he was dealing with something far more dangerous than he had anticipated. The forest held ancient secrets, forces that had awakened, and Milo's intervention had somehow stirred them. As he entered his cottage, he found the cubs huddled around Shadow, their eyes wide and fearful. They sensed the darkness he had brought back with him, the danger that now hung over them all like a shroud. Milo's mind raced, searching for a way to protect the cubs, to protect himself from the looming threat. But one thing was clear: the forest was no longer a sanctuary. It was a battleground, and the stakes were higher than he had ever imagined. The hunter's curse. The days that followed felt like a descent into an unknown nightmare. Milo's home, once a sanctuary nestled between the ocean and the forest, had transformed into a place of unease and lingering shadows. The cubs were restless, especially Shadow, who remained weak and silent, his eyes dull with pain. The other cubs, normally full of playful energy, now stayed close to him, their bodies forming a protective circle around their injured sibling. They seemed to sense the dark presence that loomed over them, something beyond their comprehension, yet woven into the fabric of the forest they once roamed freely. Milo couldn't erase the memory of the cloaked figure in the forest, nor the ominous warning it had issued. "The forest has been claimed," it had said. The words echoed in his mind, each syllable a reminder that he had stumbled into a realm far darker than he had ever anticipated. He spent his days fortifying his cottage, though he knew in his heart that no amount of physical preparation would protect him or the cubs from what was coming. He set traps around the perimeter, laid lines of salt at the door, and even hung talismans of protection above each window. His desperation drove him to every length, every superstition he could recall, in the hope that something, anything, might ward off the encroaching darkness. One night, as he sat by the flickering fire, lost in thought, Milo was startled by a sharp rap at the door. His hand went instinctively to the knife at his side. His body tensed. In the silence that followed, he heard the soft, uneven breathing of someone, or something, just beyond the door. A chill crept down his spine as he rose, his steps cautious, the floorboards creaking beneath him. The cubs stirred, their ears pricking up as they watched him approach the door, their eyes wide and alert. Slowly, Milo opened the door, knife at the ready. Standing there was a young woman, her hair tangled and her clothes torn, as though she had just escaped from the clutches of the forest. She looked exhausted, her face pale and streaked with dirt, her eyes filled with a haunting desperation. Her gaze darted around the room, lingering on the cubs before finally meeting Milo's. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I need your help. They're coming for me." Milo's grip on the knife loosened as he took in her fragile appearance. He stepped aside, allowing her to enter, and she sank into a chair by the fire, her body visibly trembling. He offered her water and wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, his questions bubbling up yet held back by the urgency in her eyes. After a moment of silence, she spoke, her voice a shaky whisper. "They call themselves the Shadowborn. They worship something ancient, something that demands blood." Milo's heart sank as he listened, a sinking realization dawning upon him. "You mean the figure in the forest? The one with the symbols on his face?" The woman nodded, her hands gripping the edges of the blanket as if to anchor herself. "Yes, they believe they are servants of the forest's ancient spirit, a spirit that has grown vengeful and ravenous. They trap animals, make offerings, but lately they've started hunting for something more sentient. They call it the Hunter's Curse." She looked at the cubs with sorrowful eyes. "They believe wolves are guardians of the old ways. They revere them, but also fear them. The Shadowborn believe that the bond between you and these wolves is a threat to their claim on the forest. They see you as a trespasser, one who has defied the forest's natural order." Milo's mind raced. He had known his bond with the wolves was rare, perhaps even unnatural in the eyes of others, but he had never thought it would draw such ire. The wolves were his family, his companions, not symbols of some ancient curse. But now he could see that his connection with them had set him on a collision course with forces he couldn't understand. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked, his voice laced with a mixture of fear and anger. The woman took a shaky breath, her gaze fixed on the fire as if the flames held the answers she sought. "Because I was once part of them, the Shadowborn. I followed their ways, believed in their rituals, but when I realized what they were willing to do, the lives they were willing to destroy, I left, and they've been hunting me ever since." She paused, her hands trembling. "They'll come for you too. You, the cubs, anyone who stands in the way of their devotion to the forest's darker side." Milo stared at her, processing the weight of her words. He felt a strange kinship with this woman, a shared sense of betrayal by the very wilderness they had both revered. She had once been part of the darkness that now haunted him, but her defection had placed her on the same path as him, hunted by the shadows she had once embraced. "What can we do?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost resigned. She looked up at him, her expression fierce. "We fight. We protect what is ours. There is a way to break the curse they've placed on the forest, but it requires something they don't expect, a human's willingness to sacrifice. The only way to sever their connection to the forest spirit is to return what they've taken. They've stolen the forest's guardians, the wolves, through their traps and snares, disrupting the balance. We have to restore it." Milo's thoughts turned to Shadow, the cub's injuries, and the snare that had nearly claimed his life. He realized now that it hadn't been a random trap. It was part of the ritual, a symbolic offering to the forest. He clenched his fists, anger welling up inside him at the thought of these people using the wolves as pawns in their twisted beliefs. The woman continued, her voice steady. "The altar you saw in the forest, the one with Luna's tooth, is where they perform their rites. They believe that by placing tokens of the forest creatures there, they can absorb their strength, their vitality. But we can use that altar too. If we return these tokens to the earth, if we cleanse them, we can break their hold over the forest." Milo's resolve hardened. He was no warrior, but he was a protector. The cubs had been by his side for years, trusting him, sharing their world with him. He would not abandon them to the whims of a deranged cult. He nodded to the woman, a silent agreement passing between them. They spent the rest of the night preparing. Milo gathered everything he thought they might need, more dried meat for the journey, a small pouch of salt, and a few herbal remedies he had learned from the villagers. The woman showed him a series of symbols, protective marks she had learned during her time with the Shadowborn, and together they painted these symbols on the door and windows of the cottage, hoping they would provide some measure of protection for the cubs while they were away. At dawn, with the first light breaking over the horizon, they set out into the forest. The cubs watched them leave, their eyes filled with a sorrowful understanding. Shadow, weak but awake, let out a soft whimper, and Milo knelt beside him, his hand gently ruffling the cub's fur. "I'll be back," he whispered. "I promise." The journey through the forest was grueling. The woman led the way, guiding them through paths hidden from normal sight, paths used by the Shadowborn for their rituals and secret gatherings. The forest grew denser as they moved deeper, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. Shadows flitted through the trees, shapes that seemed to shift and move with a will of their own, following them silently, watching. Finally, they reached the hollow where the altar stood, the twisted symbols and remnants of dark offerings still present. Milo's stomach turned at the sight, his anger simmering beneath his fear. The woman stepped forward, drawing a small vial of salt from her pouch. She sprinkled it over the altar, murmuring words in a language Milo didn't understand, a language that seemed to echo in the silence of the forest. Then, with great reverence, she placed Luna's tooth on the altar. Milo followed her lead, placing a few small bones and tokens he had found near the traps set by the Shadowborn. Each item felt heavy with meaning, as though he was laying to rest not just the tokens themselves, but the suffering they represented. As they finished, the forest seemed to hold its breath. The silence grew deeper, pressing in on them. And then, just as Milo began to question if their ritual had worked, a low rumble shook the ground beneath their feet. The air grew thick, and the trees seemed to sway in unison, as if bowing to a force unseen. Out of the shadows, figures emerged, the Shadowborn. Their faces were covered with the same twisted symbols he had seen before, their eyes blank and soulless, focused on him and the woman. They moved slowly, surrounding the hollow, their presence filling the air with a sinister energy. The woman took a step forward, her voice clear and unwavering. "We return what you have stolen. The forest's spirit will be freed from your greed, your darkness." A murmur of disapproval swept through the Shadowborn, but they didn't move closer. Milo felt the ground shift beneath him again, and the air grew colder, a biting chill that seeped into his bones. He realized, in that moment, that the forest itself was awakening, stirring with a life he had never felt before. One by one, the Shadowborn began to retreat, their expressions dark with defeat, as though they, too, felt the shift in the forest's allegiance. Milo and the woman stood their ground, watching as the figures faded back into the trees, swallowed by the shadows they had once commanded. When the last of the Shadowborn had disappeared, Milo felt the tension release. The forest, once ominous and foreboding, now felt peaceful. The oppressive weight had lifted, replaced by a sense of tranquility, as though the land was finally at rest. Milo and the woman returned to the cottage as the first light of dawn broke through the canopy. The cubs greeted them with joy, their tails wagging, their eyes bright with relief. Shadow, though weak, managed a soft bark, his eyes shining with gratitude. The woman lingered a moment at the door, her gaze softening as she looked at Milo. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with genuine emotion. She turned, disappearing into the forest, her silhouette merging with the trees. As Milo watched her leave, he felt a quiet peace settle over him. He had confronted the darkness that had threatened his home, his forest, and emerged victorious. The bond between him and the wolves remained unbroken, a testament to the strength and resilience of the wild, a connection forged not by blood, but by trust and love. And for the first time in weeks, as he watched the cubs play around his feet, he felt that his forest, his sanctuary, was truly his once again. The spirit of the forest, With the darkness dispelled and the Shadowborn's influence severed, Milo thought the worst had finally passed. The forest was calm once more, its air thick with the scent of pine and autumn leaves, and the familiar calls of birds and rustling animals had returned. Yet despite the peace that now blanketed the land, Milo couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered, an echo of the spirit he had felt stirring beneath the earth in the hollow. The forest had changed, and though it now felt safer, there was an intensity to it, a watchful presence, that hadn't been there before. Days passed, and Shadow began to heal, his strength returning bit by bit. The other cubs stayed close to him, celebrating his recovery with small yips and nudges, their eyes bright with relief. They would often look to Milo as if he were a member of their pack, their loyalty unwavering. It was in these quiet, simple moments with the cubs that Milo felt his purpose renewed. He knew now that his bond with them was no accident. It was a gift, an ancient connection to the wild, and he had a duty to honor it. One evening, as dusk settled over Seabrook, Milo noticed an unusual pattern among the wolves. Luna, normally a quiet presence in the forest, had begun to appear near the edge of his clearing, watching him with her piercing blue eyes. She would sit there for hours, her gaze unwavering, as if waiting for something. And though her presence was comforting, Milo sensed a tension in her posture. There was a quiet urgency in her behavior, as though she was trying to communicate something important. The other wolves, too, had grown restless, their howls echoing through the forest in mournful harmony, filling the air with a sense of yearning and mystery. Then, one night, Luna approached him directly. Milo had been sitting by the fire outside his cottage, enjoying the peace of the evening, when she emerged from the shadows, her fur gleaming in the moonlight. She walked slowly, deliberately, her gaze fixed on him, with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. The other wolves followed, gathering around him in a silent, watchful circle. Milo looked around, his heart pounding, as he realized they were waiting for him to follow them. Understanding that this was no ordinary visit, he rose, gathering his coat and his knife. The wolves waited patiently, their eyes reflecting the firelight as they watched him prepare. With a deep breath, Milo nodded to Luna, and she turned, leading him into the depths of the forest. The pack moved in near silence, their steps light and purposeful, their eyes focused on a path only they knew. As they ventured deeper, the familiar landmarks began to disappear, replaced by towering trees and ancient stones, their surfaces covered in thick moss and twisted vines. The forest grew darker, the air heavy with an earthy scent that seemed to reach back through the ages, calling forth memories of a time when man and beast walked as one. Milo felt a surge of respect for the wolves, for the bond they had offered him, and he walked in their silent procession, trusting them completely. After what felt like hours of winding through the dense woods, they reached a secluded clearing, a place Milo had never seen before. At the center of the clearing stood an enormous tree, its gnarled roots sprawling across the ground like the fingers of an ancient giant. Its trunk was thick and twisted, its bark dark and weathered, and its branches stretched out like arms, embracing the forest around it. This tree, Milo sensed, was older than any he had seen. It was ancient, a relic of the forest's soul, its silent guardian. Luna stopped in front of the tree, her gaze shifting from Milo to the roots of the massive trunk. Following her lead, Milo looked down and saw a shallow depression in the earth, a hollow space nestled between the roots. Inside lay a scattering of items: animal bones, fragments of broken pottery, and what appeared to be a collection of stones arranged in a deliberate pattern. Each item seemed to hold a story, a memory of the forest's history, its pain and resilience, etched into these small tokens of life and death. A faint glow emanated from the roots, a soft, pulsating light that seemed to breathe with the rhythm of the earth itself. Milo knelt beside it, feeling the warmth radiate through him, a connection to the forest that was as old as the trees and rivers, a bond that tied him to the land in ways he couldn't fully understand. Luna nudged him gently, her eyes softening as she watched him. It was then that Milo realized she was inviting him to add something of his own, to offer a piece of himself to this ancient spirit, to become part of the forest's story. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the wolf's tooth he had kept since the first night he'd met the mysterious figure in the forest. The tooth felt warm in his hand, as though it held a part of Luna's spirit, a connection to the wild that he had cherished. With a deep breath, he placed the tooth among the other artifacts, his fingers brushing the rough surface of the roots. The moment his hand touched the earth, he felt a powerful energy surge through him, a force that seemed to pull him into the forest's heartbeat. He closed his eyes, letting the sensation wash over him, feeling the presence of the ancient spirit that dwelled within the forest, a presence that was both comforting and formidable. When he opened his eyes, he saw something remarkable. The tree's bark had shifted, revealing markings that hadn't been there before, symbols and shapes that mirrored the ones he had seen on the trees near the Shadowborn's camp. Only these were different. They felt alive, imbued with a purpose and wisdom that transcended the Shadowborn's crude imitations. The symbols glowed faintly, their light mingling with the fireflies that danced around them, illuminating the clearing with a gentle, ethereal glow. Milo felt an overwhelming sense of belonging, a knowledge that he was no longer a mere visitor in the forest, but a part of its ancient lineage. The wolves had shared their secret with him, entrusted him with their sacred bond, and he knew he would do everything in his power to honor it. But as he knelt there, immersed in the forest's energy, he sensed something shifting in the distance. A soft whisper echoed through the trees, a warning that filled him with a sudden urgency. The forest was watching over him, but it was also preparing him for something. A threat that had not yet passed, a final trial he would have to face to protect the wolves and his home. Rising to his feet, Milo looked down at Luna, his resolve strengthened. He understood now that he was not merely a fisherman or an observer of the wild. He was a guardian, a protector of the balance that sustained the forest. And though the Shadowborn had been driven back, their hunger for power and control over the ancient spirit had not been fully quenched. He knew they would return, their desperation driving them to reclaim what they believed was theirs. As he turned to leave the clearing, he felt a deep sense of peace, tempered by the knowledge that he would soon face a final confrontation. The wolves flanked him as he made his way back to the cottage, their presence a comfort and a reminder of the trust they had placed in him. They would fight by his side, defend their home with a ferocity that matched his own, for they too understood the stakes. The return journey was silent, each step bringing him closer to his cottage and the life he had built on the edge of this wild, ancient land. When he arrived, the cubs greeted him with joyful yips, their tails wagging as they circled around him, their excitement contagious. Shadow, now much stronger, patted over and pressed his head against Milo's leg, his eyes bright with gratitude. Milo knelt, placing a gentle hand on Shadow's head. "It's time," he whispered, his voice soft yet resolute. "We have a duty to protect this place, to keep it safe from those who seek to harm it." That night, as he sat by the fire, Milo felt the forest's presence around him, a comforting weight that settled over his home like a protective shroud. The wolves lay beside him, their bodies warm and solid against the chill of the night air, their trust filling him with a courage he hadn't known he possessed. As he drifted off to sleep, he knew that when the Shadowborn returned, they would find him ready. The forest had accepted him, woven him into its tapestry, and he would stand as its defender, a guardian bound by blood and spirit to the wolves and the ancient force that lived in the roots of the trees and the depths of the earth. In his dreams, he saw the tree in the clearing, its branches stretching toward the sky, each leaf a part of the forest's spirit, its roots entwined with the stories of those who had come before. And at the center of it all, he saw himself, standing beside Luna and the cubs, his heart full of purpose, his soul bound to the wilderness that had become his family. Tomorrow, he knew, would bring a battle. But tonight, as the forest watched over him and the wolves, Milo felt no fear. He was ready to defend his home, ready to face whatever darkness the Shadowborn might bring. For he was no longer just a man. He was a part of the forest, and the forest was a part of him. The final confrontation. Dawn arrived cloaked in mist, casting an ethereal veil over Seabrook and the forest beyond. Milo stood at the edge of his clearing, his breath visible in the cool morning air, his gaze fixed on the shadowed tree line. He could feel the forest's presence behind him, steady and vigilant, as if it, too, awaited what was to come. The wolves sat silently around him, their eyes sharp, their bodies tense with anticipation. Even the cubs seemed to understand the gravity of the moment, their playful innocence replaced by a quiet resilience as they pressed close to their mother, Luna. As the morning stretched on, a strange silence fell over the woods. No birds called, no rustling leaves disturbed the air. It was as if the entire forest held its breath. The wolves' ears twitched, their noses raised, and Milo sensed it too, an encroaching presence, one that carried with it the familiar chill of malice and darkness. The Shadowborn were approaching. Milo felt the hair on the back of his neck rise as he caught sight of them through the trees. Figures emerged from the shadows, cloaked and silent, their faces painted with the same twisted symbols he'd seen before, their eyes hollow and cruel. They moved in unison, an eerie, rhythmic procession that made them seem more like specters than men. At their forefront was the figure Milo remembered vividly, the leader of the Shadowborn, the one who had confronted him in the forest with those chilling words about the hunter's curse. The leader's gaze settled on Milo, his expression one of cold disdain. His voice, low and resonant, cut through the silence like a blade. "You were warned," he said, his tone devoid of empathy. "The forest is ours by right, by blood and spirit. You, a mere mortal, dare to defy us, to disrupt our ancient bond." Milo's pulse quickened, but he held his ground, his hand resting on the knife at his side. "The forest belongs to no one," he replied, his voice steady. "It's a sanctuary for all who respect it, who live in harmony with its ways. What you do is not harmony, it's corruption." The leader's eyes narrowed, his expression twisting with anger. "You speak of harmony, yet you have taken what is not yours. You've bound yourself to the guardians of this land, but that bond will only bring suffering. The spirit of the forest demands sacrifice, demands submission, and you are nothing but an interloper." With a flick of his wrist, the leader gestured to the Shadowborn surrounding him, and they stepped forward, forming a half-circle around Milo and the wolves. Their movements were precise, coordinated, and Milo could sense the dark energy radiating from them, a palpable hatred that seemed to seep into the very soil beneath their feet. Luna's low growl broke the silence, her fur bristling as she stood protectively before her pack. The other wolves joined her, their bodies coiled, their eyes fixed on the approaching figures. They were ready to fight, their loyalty to Milo and their home unwavering. Milo felt a surge of gratitude as he glanced at Luna and the pack, their silent support strengthening his resolve. He knew he couldn't back down, couldn't let the Shadowborn desecrate the forest any longer. Steeling himself, he took a step forward, his voice ringing out with a strength he hadn't known he possessed. "Leave this place," he demanded. "The forest has rejected you, and you will find no power here." The leader's face twisted into a sneer. "Rejected us? We are the chosen, the ones who have communed with the spirit of this land since time immemorial. You, an outsider, cannot command us." He raised his arms, his voice growing louder, filled with a dark reverence. "We call upon the spirit of the forest, the shadow that resides within. Hear us, and grant us the strength to rid this place of those who defy us." The ground beneath them shuddered, and a low, ominous hum filled the air. The forest, which had been so silent moments before, seemed to come alive, but not in a way Milo recognized. The trees groaned, their branches creaking as if weighed down by an invisible force, and a dark mist began to swirl around the Shadowborn, coiling like snakes around their legs. Milo felt a pang of fear, but he forced himself to stay calm. He remembered the ancient tree, the heartbeat of the forest he had felt in its roots, and he knew that the true spirit of the forest was not the malevolent force the Shadowborn worshipped. They had twisted its energy, corrupted it, but beneath that darkness lay a purity, a power that had yet to be unleashed. Closing his eyes, Milo steadied his breathing, reaching out with his spirit as he had done in the clearing with Luna. He focused on the bond he shared with the wolves, on the trust and loyalty they had given him. He reached deeper into the depths of the forest's soul, searching for the ancient spirit that had accepted him, that had welcomed him into its family. A warmth spread through him, a gentle, pulsing energy that grew stronger with each beat. The forest responded, its true power rising to meet his call. He felt it wrap around him, filling him with strength, with a fierce love for this land and the creatures that called it home. When he opened his eyes, he saw the Shadowborn falter, their confidence wavering as they felt the shift in the forest's energy. The mist that had surrounded them began to recede, drawn away by an invisible force, and the darkness in their eyes dimmed as a golden light broke through the canopy above, bathing the clearing in a soft, radiant glow. The leader's face contorted with rage and desperation. "No, this cannot be. The spirit belongs to us." He raised his arms again, chanting in a language Milo didn't recognize, but his words seemed hollow, powerless against the light that now filled the forest. Luna let out a powerful howl, and the other wolves joined her, their voices rising in unison, a song of defiance that reverberated through the trees. The sound was hauntingly beautiful, a reminder of the forest's true nature, of the harmony that the Shadowborn had sought to destroy. The wolves advanced, their bodies moving with a grace and strength that filled Milo with awe. They were not just animals. They were the guardians of this land, and they would protect it with every fiber of their being. In a final act of desperation, the leader lunged at Milo, his face twisted with hatred. But before he could reach him, Luna sprang forward, her powerful body colliding with his, knocking him to the ground. She stood over him, her teeth bared, a fierce light in her eyes that left no doubt as to her loyalty. The leader scrambled backward, fear now evident in his gaze as he realized he had lost. The other Shadowborn looked to him, their confidence shattered, their allegiance wavering. One by one, they began to back away, retreating into the shadows from which they had come, their faces pale, their dark energy dissipating like smoke in the breeze. The leader glared at Milo, his voice a low hiss. "This isn't over. The forest spirit is eternal, and it will remember your defiance." With that, he turned and disappeared into the woods, his footsteps fading until all that remained was the soft rustling of leaves. Milo let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his body relaxing as the tension drained away. He knelt beside Luna, reaching out to touch her fur, a silent gesture of gratitude. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with warmth, and in that moment, he felt the unbreakable bond between them, a connection forged through loyalty, trust, and shared purpose. The wolves gathered around him, their bodies pressing close as if to shield him, to offer him comfort. He felt their acceptance, their unity, and he knew that he had become a part of something greater than himself, a guardian of the wild, bound to the spirit of the forest in a way that could never be broken. As the sun rose higher, casting a warm glow over the forest, Milo felt a deep peace settle over him. The darkness had been driven back, its influence severed, and the forest had reclaimed its soul, its ancient power restored. He looked around at the wolves, his heart swelling with gratitude and love for the creatures that had stood by his side, that had given him a family, a purpose. In the days that followed, Milo continued his life as a fisherman, but he was no longer just a man of the sea. He was now a part of the forest, woven into its roots, its branches, its heartbeat. The wolves remained by his side, their bond with him stronger than ever, a testament to the spirit of the wild and the power of loyalty. And as the seasons changed, as the forest grew and flourished, Milo knew that he and the wolves would always protect it, standing as silent guardians, bound to the land they called home. The Shadowborn were gone, their darkness banished, but the memory of their threat served as a reminder that the forest spirit would always need protectors, those willing to stand between the wild and the forces that sought to claim it. In the quiet of the night, as the wolves howled under the silver light of the moon, Milo would join them, his voice mingling with theirs, a song of resilience and unity. Together, they were a family, a pack, bound by a love for the land and for each other, a bond that no darkness could ever sever. And in that song, in that quiet, powerful harmony, Milo found his peace, his purpose, his place in the wild that he would protect until his last breath.